All right, so I've sent a link to the handout for our first lesson. You can click that in the chat. Those who are watching on YouTube afterwards, it should be in the description as well. So this is the beginning of a 10-part series called "The Jewish Value of Giving." It's a short class each week. Every week we'll cover a different topic. This week we're covering the topic of why give. Next week, what are the benefits of giving? And then week 3, how much to give. Week 4, when giving is hard. Week 5, priorities in giving. Week 6, must my motives be pure? Week 7, should my gift be publicized? Week 8, a history of Jewish giving. Week 9, instilling the value of tzedakah. And week 10, the time is now. Those are the topics that we're going to cover. And let me just give a little background of why I decided to do this course. So um, in 2024, uh, in the US alone, there was $592.5 billion donated to charity throughout the country, which is a lot of money. I'm not going to do the math, but it's more than $1,000 per person on average per U.S. citizen. Now, however, within the Jewish community, I read a statistic from 2022 that your average Jewish household has given over $10,000 that year to charity. So, and it's not a secret. These are just some facts and numbers, but it's not a secret that it's embedded in Jewish culture that we're givers. It's part of who we are. And as Jews, we always look back before we look forward, and we have a lot to look back to in terms of our history of giving, our culture, and more importantly, and this is what we're focusing on in this course, is our texts and our literature, our Jewish teachings, which is ultimately where these values and where this culture of giving comes from. So the big question that we're covering today is why does Judaism, you have it in your handout also, why does Judaism place such central importance on tzedakah? Is giving merely an act of kindness, or is it something more fundamental? So we're just trying to understand why is this such a big part of Jewish culture and tradition. So to start with, going back to the father of the Jewish nation, Avram Avinu, Abraham, he is known to be a giver. In fact, Abraham was famous for giving food to all the passersby, always being very hospitable and charitable. Um, and it was from that uniqueness of Abraham, from his giving nature, that God said, you know what, I'm going to make you into a nation. I love what you're doing so much. I'm going to make a nation from you, a nation, essentially a Abrahamic nation, a nation of givers. That's part and parcel of who the descendants of Abraham are, that we are givers. In fact, the Talmud even tells us this is a fundamental trait of what it is to be a Jew. It says there are three signs of what a Jew is. It says Baishanim, bashfulness, Rachmanim, compassionate, and Goim lechasadim, givers of kindness. So this is really a big part of who we are. I want to just point out we have the source here, one of the primary sources that we're basing this, I guess, the thesis of this lesson off, is from Bereshis, the book of Genesis, in chapter 18, verse 19. You see, it says, "For I have known him that he will instruct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, to perform tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and justice." So it's not just that Abraham himself is somebody who does kindness, but God is saying that I am instructing him and his children afterwards to do tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and kindness. And so, as Jews, we feel it in our bones that we want to give, and it's almost like we need to give, and it's not just that we live in order to sustain ourselves, but part and parcel of our own living is being able to and acting upon that ability to give to others. So that's a very big part of what it is to be a Jew. Now, there's a very interesting medrash. Um, you have it in the handout, just an excerpt of it, which is a conversation that King David had with God. He had a conversation with the master of the universe, and he was asking him, can we implement a little more equality? I don't know if he called it socialism. I don't know what word he used, but he wanted more equality, and he asked God, um, um, Master of the universe, why did you not make all people equal? And God responded by saying, if so, if all were equal, chesed ve'emes man yinseru. Who would preserve, who would practice kindness and truth? So, in other words, God created this imbalance in this world in order to allow for the concept of giving. You see, if everybody just received from God, and we're all receivers, in other words, then none of us would be givers. In order to facilitate the concept of giving, therefore, God created some people who have more than others so that people have the ability to give to others. Now, we're going to get into some of the later lessons, like how does this apply to somebody who doesn't have a lot of means? Do they need to give? Should they give? Can they give? Is this part of what it's meant to be? But over here, we're talking about generally speaking. Let's talk about the rule before the exception. Generally speaking, somebody who has means should be a giver because that's the way God created the world intentionally. That this is how we preserve the values of kindness, the values of truth. I want to also share a little bit of a Hasidic perspective on this whole concept. You see, Hasidus talks about the purpose of existence, right? Like what are we working towards in this world altogether? And in one of the more lengthy chapters of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, he goes into explaining, what's the purpose. He literally starts off the chapter by saying, what's the purpose of Mashiach and the resurrection of the dead? And the purpose is to have the revelation of godliness in this world. Now, how do we reveal godliness in a physical world? Very simple, by doing physical acts in a godly way. Now, you can do the physical act of opening up a prayer book and reciting words of prayer. Yeah, that's technically, that's also physical. You're moving your lips, right? Your throat is emitting sound, right? So yes, that's certainly physical, but the quintessential act of physicality that is spiritual is the act of tzedakah. So much so that tzedakah is known as a mitzvah that is equal to all the other mitzvahs. Why is that? Because all other mitzvahs involve one limb or another, right? When you eat kosher, your digestive system is doing a mitzvah, right? When you pray, your mouth is doing a mitzvah. When you walk to shul, your feet are doing a mitzvah. But the difference with tzedakah is it's not just the hand that's handing over the coin to charity. It's not just the fingers that are typing in the credit card number online or whatever it might be. But we have to backtrack a second and understand, where's this money coming from? In a very pragmatic way. It's coming from a person's hard work. It's coming from their blood, sweat, and tears, where they invested hours and hours of their time and energy, putting in their whole mind, body, and soul into the work they do. And as a result of that, they earned payment in return. Of course, we're not talking about money that comes from theft or anything forbidden, but you worked hard, you put your blood, sweat, and tears, your whole kishkis, as we say in Yiddish, right? You put your whole being into something, and now you take what you earned from that and you give it to charity, you are now elevating all of that activity, that was until such point was considered mundane, right? You're just working. I don't know, you might be packing boxes, you might be filling out paperwork as a lawyer, whatever it might be, which is mundane. It's not necessarily holy. But the moment you give a portion of that to charity, to tzedakah, all of that work, all of that energy that you invested now becomes elevated. Now you're making all of those papers that you filled out, all of those boxes that you taped with Scotch tape, or if you're an Uber driver, all those miles that you've driven, all of those are now elevated because of the act of tzedakah. So tzedakah is, I would say, the gateway to elevating the entire existence to spirituality. Because otherwise, how does every mundane act that we do become spiritual? It's specifically through this act of translating the hard-earned money into a mitzvah. That's how we make all of those activities into something holy. So that's another, just more from a spiritual perspective of the importance and why it is that our sages tell us that tzedakah is equal to all the other mitzvahs, because this is really elevating all facets of our life into holiness, which ultimately, when we do that, when we make the world a holy place, we're making the world ready for the coming of Mashiach. And I want to just share another source over here, which is from Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the Rosh, the Arba Turim. This is in the Code of Jewish Law, in the Laws of Charity. He says that that it's important to give charity according to one's means. This is obvious, right? But here's the point he says, very interesting. He says that it's important to give tzedakah because we are asking God day in, day out to provide for our needs, right? We're asking God, He doesn't owe us anything, but yet we're asking him, be kind, be generous, and give us what we need. So God says, sure, no problem. Let me see how well you're doing in that department, right? Are there people out there who are asking you to be kind and give them what they need from your kindness? Non-obligatory, right? Somebody in the street, why do you have to be the one to give them their money, right? But the fact that you go ahead and go beyond the letter of the law, so to speak, we'll soon talk about what is the letter of the law, what isn't. But in terms of what one would think is an obligation, right? If we go beyond our intuitive understanding of what's right and fair, and we're kind to others, then says the Arba Turim, it says that God will also be kind to us in a similar vein as we were to others. And so he says that, obviously this is something very challenging. And the Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, says, mathematically this doesn't work out. Because if I'm going to give some of my hard-earned money to somebody else, then I'm going to end up with a net negative, right? So why should I give to somebody else, especially if it's very difficult, or just for whatever the reason is? Just mathematically, it seems like I'll end up with less. And the Baal Turim says that the truth of the money is the truth of the matter is that the word for tzedakah is the word for charity is tzedakah, which means justice. In other words, the only reason why God gave us the money in the first place is so that we should give to others. In other words, the money was never given to us as a permanent gift, but actually the money was given to us as a deposit. And God is seeing how well we do with that deposit. How well do we invest God's money? And so if we invest it wisely, and wisely not by our own account, but wisely by God's account, by God's definition of wisely, then God will say, you know what? This guy is a good custodian of my money, and so I'll invest more into having him hold on to my money because I know he allocates it and disperses it the way it should be. And so it's not that's why the word tzedakah means justice. In other words, we're doing justice with God's money. We're doing what God would want for us to do with that money. Now, that doesn't mean we give all of it away. Obviously, the deposit is part of the understanding is that we use it for ourselves, for our own livelihood. But crucial to that is that we also pass on some of that to others as an act of justice, as an act of tzedakah, doing justice to the depositor, which is God who gave us the money in the first place. And just a more contemporary source, which comes from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. He says, we see in Devarim, it says in the Torah that you shouldn't close your hand. It says, "Loisa'amet says levavcha, do not harden your heart. V'laisikbait says yadcha, and you shouldn't close your hand." What he's saying is that naturally, the Jewish heart and the Jewish hand is open for charity. It's like we started off by saying, it's natural to who we are. Statistically, you just see in the fact of the matter is that Jews are big givers. And so the Torah is telling us that for you to not give is actually an act of closing. It's not just the absence of opening your hand, but in fact, it's the act of closing your hand, because naturally our hand is open to giving, and anything contrary to that is actually running contrary to our nature. And I just want to end off with one short story about Sir Moses Montefiore, who was a great philanthropist in London. And he obtained high office in the city of London, and he actually lived a very, very long life, I think from like 1784 to 1885, something like that. And at the celebration of his 100th birthday, there was a lot of editorials written about him and his great philanthropy, and said that that he exemplified how fervent Judaism and patriotic citizenship were actually completely consistent with one another. In other words, he held on strong to his Jewish values, but he was also a patriotic citizen of the United Kingdom. Now, they asked him in one of the interviews around his birthday, they asked him, "Tell me, Sir Moses, what are you worth? You're a rich man. What are you worth?" And so he gave out some figure which was far less than what we would understand to be his net worth. And and so the interviewer pressed him further and saying, "Are you sure? Like, you're worth a lot more than that." He said, "Well, you didn't ask me how what's the value of all my assets. You asked me what I am worth. And I am worth the money that I gave to charity. So I made a calculation in my head of how much money have I given to charity over the years. And you asked me, what are you worth? That's how much I'm worth." And so that's how we explain that. Anyways, that's the end for this week's lesson. And next week we're going to talk about, if giving is so central to Jewish life, what does Judaism say that tzedakah that actually accomplishes both for the giver, for the recipient, and for society at large. So we'll explore that next week. And thank you for joining, and I'm happy to take your questions.